United Nations troops push on in the cautious advance against the communists. An advance whose purpose, General Ridgway states, is not to seize ground, but to wipe out the enemy.
For this genealogy project, I'll be talking about someone who was very important to me. His name was Philip Keeler, and he lived from 1930 to 2015. He was a businessman and former veteran who exerted a significant influence in my life. He was actually a farm boy from Richfield, Connecticut, and I remember how he would tell me that he hated it, as he had to wake up every single day at 5 a.m. to milk the cows. He had one sibling who was mentally retarded, and contrary to what many people may think, she had a strong influence in his life. This is because though she didn't provide much wisdom and life skills directly, she served as a vehicle for my grandfather to mature and be responsible for 2 lives, not just one. His parents made sure to provide a good education. This allowed him to go to the University of Pennsylvania and chase his true passion, which was essentially not farming. Now, during his time in college, he always sought to serve in the military, but he understood that a college degree allowed him to enter as a second lieutenant. Now, it's important to know that right around the time that he went to college, the Korean War was stirring up. The Korean War was a war between North Korea, with the support of China and the Soviet Union, and South Korea, with the support of the United Nations and the United States. The war began in 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea, following a series of clashes along the border. As a product of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, Korea had been split into 2 sovereign states in 1948. A socialist state was established in the north, under the communist leadership of Kim Il-sung, and a capitalist state in the south under the anti-communist leadership of Syngman Rhee. Both governments of the 2 new Korean states claimed to be the sole legitimate government of all of Korea, and neither accepted the border as permanent. The conflict escalated into warfare when North Korean military forces crossed the border and advanced south into South Korea on June 25, 1950. The United Nations Security Council authorized the formation and dispatch of UN forces to Korea in an effort to repel what was recognized as a North Korean invasion. 21 countries of the United Nations eventually contributed to the UN force, with the United States providing around 90% of the military personnel. Now, after graduating from college in 1952, Philip Keeler, my grandfather, was deployed in Korea and assigned to a platoon whom he oversaw. Now, this war had great significance in my family. My grandmother was actually a nurse during the war, and my grandfather met her when one of his soldiers was shot and wounded. In an effort to understand the true meaning of this war and the effects it had on my family, I decided to interview Sheila Keeler, my grandmother. When I asked her, what significance did the war have on the family, she responded, and I quote, "Well, in addition to having met Philip in the war, I believe that the conflict had a significant impact on our family because it altered our ways of perceiving what life entails. Before the war, your grandfather had no intentions of having children. His plan in life was to enlist in the military and climb up the ranks until he became a general. All of that changed in the midst of the war. The Korean War hit Philip in unprecedented ways that changed his outlook and approach to certain affairs. And the same thing can be said for America. The Korean War significantly altered the way America approached world affairs. In fact, many historians pinpoint the war as evidence of the first American military reaction to the spread of communism. So, arguably, this gave rise to the beginning of the Cold War in regard to military action. In 1950, a National Security Council report, shown as the NSC 68, had echoed Truman's recommendation that the country use military forces to contain communist expansionism anywhere it seemed to be occurring. To that end, the report called for a 4-fold increase in defense spending. According to the History Channel, the first military action of the Cold War began when the Soviet fact, North Korean People's Army invaded its pro-Western neighbor to the south. Many American officials feared that this was the first step in a communist campaign to take over the world and deemed that non-intervention was not an option.
On hearing the grave news, President Truman flies to Washington from his Missouri home. The president described the invasion as a threat to the peace which cannot be tolerated.
The Korean War left a long-lasting impact on American politics. This war shaped the course of the Cold War by both resolving the incoherence which characterized the U.S. foreign and defense efforts in the period of 1946 to 1950 and establishing important new lines of policy. Furthermore, if the war had not taken place, no other event that were likely to have occurred would have produced the effects that Korea did. Unlike many earlier turning points, such as the British withdrawal from Greece and Turkey in 1947, there were few functional substitutes for Korea. Thus, without Korea, international history would have been very different. The Korean War boosted GDP via government spending, although this spending was financed by taxation as opposed to World War II, which was primarily debt-financed. Investment and consumption flattened, while the overall growth rate was driven by government spending. President Truman relied largely on taxation and a reduction in non-military outlays, as opposed to borrowing from the public or money creation policies to finance the conflict. In order to facilitate this, the government enacted the Revenue Act of 1950, which reinstituted the income tax rates of World War II, boosting taxes by an estimated 1.3% of the GDP. Material well-being was affected by tax increases, new price and wage controls, which contained private sector consumption and investment. However, perhaps of more impact to the U.S. economy over the ensuing years was that of two key components of GDP, consumption and investment. By 1959, the gap between actual consumer spending and its pre-World War II injection had become substantial. Similarly, the investment component failed to keep up with its pre-war trend. During the period of 1848 to 1959, it is more or less flat, showing no growth at all. The subdued consumer spending can be partly explained by the financing of the wars that also contributed to the stagnant investment during that period. Finally, though this war had been overshadowed by World War II and the Vietnam War in the minds of many Americans, it had a dramatic effect on social change in the United States. Gerald Early, who was writing a book on the Korean War's impact on integration and racial relations in the United States, contends that the Korean War was a driving force behind integration efforts during early years of the Civil Rights Movement. President Harry S. Truman issued an executive order integrating armed forces in 1948, something that had been recommended by this Commission on Civil Rights. But it was the Korean War, argues Early, which helped truly initiate this integration. It was a major institution, and I quote, "It was a major sociological force, and by 1954, we could look back and say that the integration of armed forces, while not complete and not perfect, went better than most detractors and most critics thought it would." Furthermore, Early argues that the successful integration of military forces in Korea encouraged the U.S. Supreme Court to make a historic decision. This was the Brown versus Board of Education, which helped change attitudes about race. Had the military failed, integration overall would have suffered. Early continues, and he says, "By the end of the war, the military had the most integrated and racially advanced institution in the United States. If for no other reason, the fact alone makes the Korean War one of the most important conflicts the country has ever engaged in." Now, the Korean War had a significant effect on a macro and micro level. Both my grandfather's life and the lives of all Americans changed drastically. Phillip gained perspective on what his life truly had to be made up of. And likewise, America shifted towards a cultural revolution that yielded the modern sociological and social-political climate as seen today.